All right, welcome to the Tabernacle residents and panelists who are joining our virtual forum tonight. We appreciate the opportunity to share information and answer questions about our upcoming referendum on Tuesday, November 8th. Our panelists have expertise on various portions of the referendum, and they're here to share what they know and will answer your questions about the forum. If you have a question, please submit it before or while the topic is being discussed to vote@tabschools.org. Your question will be directed then to the appropriate panelist, and there will be time at the end of the forum to answer more questions. If we don't get to your question, we'll follow up a response by email. Tonight's forum is broken into segments, so you can tune in for information on the topics that interest you the most. Recording the info session will be available later this week on the district's bond referendum website, which is vote.tabschools.org, as you see at the bottom of the slide. The website also has frequently asked questions and an overview of all projects included in the in the proposal, voting information, and much more. Tabernacle Schools Board of Education President Megan Chamberlain will now share more information about the upcoming bond referendum.
Welcome, community and panelists. What is a bond referendum? It is a special election held by a school district seeking public permission to sell bonds to finance large-scale projects. A bond referendum is a fiscally responsible strategy to generate upfront funding for facility improvements and important safety upgrades to our school. This would allow us to spread the cost of the project over time, similar to the way a homeowner uses a home equity loan to make improvements.
Thank you, Meg. Patricia Palmieri, Tabernacle Schools Board Business Administrator, will explain why the district is deciding to pursue a bond referendum.
Sorry, I was muted. Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. As Meg said, Tabernacle Township School District is pursuing a bond referendum to generate upfront funding for facilities improvements and important safety upgrades to our schools. Why does pursuing a bond referendum make sense for us as a district? We see this as a fiscally responsible strategy that will do a number of things. It will enable the district to access state aid available to offset the cost of the proposed improvement projects. After having state aid and funding slashed by nearly half, the bond borrowing is a way to have our district access a different line of state funding. Tabernacle residents have already paid for this money through their state taxes. This money goes into a special pot to pay for projects tied to educational needs. It can only be shared with districts where voters approve a bond referendum. And a bond referendum would make the much needed safety and facility improvements with minimal tax impact. In fact, our plan calls for school debt tax to decrease by 2026.
Thank you, Patty. More about the financial details will be discussed, later in the program. First, we want to talk about the projects that would improve our school's security and buildings to better serve our students, staff, and community. William Ted Hopkins, Principal and Vice President at FVHD Architects Planners, and Jason Dubovich, Senior Associate at FVHD Architects Planners, are here to tell us about the projects and how they benefit the schools. Ted, I'm sorry, you are muted.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you.
That. Before we get into the projects specifically, we wanted to let everyone know that this became a referendum through a bunch of projects after a facility study was done and completed for the district. This allowed the district to kind of see what was good, bad, and indifferent at the schools and select a number of projects, and mostly from the perspective of projects that probably could not easily fit within the budget of the capital expenditures that districts have. So from that perspective, it gives you an idea that it shows a priority, a prioritization of the projects that were put in front of the board and the administration, and provide a framework through that process to select those projects that are the most important, that are fundable from the Department of Education standpoint, which allows a an allocation of monies that will be discussed later in the panel, but also allow these to occur again, because they probably could not or be very difficult to be put through the process of the capital expenditures. So the project that we're starting with is basically increased security is a major topic at many school districts, and Tabernacle is no different. And they wanted to increase measures at the classroom level and also at the school-wide level. So most specifically, what we're doing is we're changing the doors, which are not to code at present, and we're adding a security lock that is very common these days. And the lock is able to be done without the teacher going out into the hallway to secure the door. This can be done inside the classroom, and it keeps everybody obviously much more safe, and it does it also much more quickly. So from that perspective, the removal of the door and the hardware, existing hardware, to this new door that is code and a new secure lock is imperative. And we're going to do that at both schools. I think that's going to be an incredible upgrade for the security of the building. In addition to that, we're going to be replacing the security alarm, also known as the intruder alarm, at both buildings, adding cameras, adding those elements to the school from a large perspective to have a better eye on who's approaching the building, how people get in, and even throughout the building. Better and more security cameras, as it says here, is going to be very important for that. Last on this list here is the fire alarm system. The fire alarm system works presently, so I don't want anybody to think that it does not, but it is not a modern system as is the newer ones out there. Right now, the existing fire alarm system is a non-addressable system. What that means is that when a smoke detector goes off or when a device goes off in the building, it's generally shown on a panel to be in a certain area of the building with no real knowledge of exactly where it is. The newer and more sophisticated fire alarm systems are done in a way that they are called addressable. That is the way they distinguish. And it is a pinpointed location of that device that is going off in that classroom or in that hallway. And it allows the fire department to see the panel and know exactly where the fire is and where they need to go. And this cuts down time that is needed to protect the building and as far as and also obviously protect the occupants. So this system, again, while it's not it's working at the present time, we believe the upgrade is needed at this time. The old systems tend to be able not to be able to get parts in the replacement of those. So I think this is going to be a really helpful addition to the school. I'm going to let Jason take over the next slide. And you're muted.
Thanks, Ted.
You bet.
I'm going to talk about some of the more maintenance-related projects as part of the bond referendum, starting with replacing the roofing system at the Olson Middle School. That roof system is more than 20 years old and is out of warranty. This would mean that any repairs to leaks and other parts of the system would be incurred directly by the district and not covered by the roof warranty. In addition, as part of the roof replacement project, the insulating value of the roof would be increased significantly, almost 3 times as insulating as the current roof system. That will, of course, result in a great deal of energy savings from the school district's part from the heating and air conditioning systems. Additionally, as I mentioned, the current roofing system has a 20-year warranty that's expired. The new roofing system would be eligible for a 30-year warranty. And it would be a similar roofing system to the one that is on there now, but a more modern version. This would include, taking care of where the roofing interfaces with all the different heights of the building and the different equipment on the roof, and would address any issues that occur right now as it relates to leaks and things like that. any parts that connect with the roof that need to be repaired would be taken care of as well. Also, maintenance would include replacement of HVAC units throughout the schools. These HVAC units have a number of advantages. While a lot of them do have air conditioning now, several of them that don't would be gaining air conditioning. These new units are much quieter. They take up a lot less space, and the last item that's very important these days is they have increased ability for filtering. They would be using what's called a MERV 13 filter, which filters out a lot more air particles than certainly units from only a few years ago, let alone the units that are in a lot of the spaces of the building, which some of them have been there since the buildings were built, over 40 years old. So they are well past their useful life, and we want to make sure we can take care of these before they become an emergency problem. Looking at the costs related, in addition to the funding that would be received as part of a bond referendum, the fact that the HVAC would be done in the entirety of the buildings or in large portions of the building would aid in the cost efficiency of replacing these systems. Unlike if they had to be replaced one by one in an emergency situation, the cost could be significantly higher. Part of the HVAC would include adding air conditioning to the middle school gym, which would really make events in that space a lot more comfortable and more enjoyable for people attending those events. An extension of the HVAC upgrades, as well as other parts of the building, would include electrical system replacements. A lot of these electrical components, such as panels, wiring, and main electrical transformers, would be replaced and or upgraded, specifically at TES, where we would be adding air conditioning. We would need to be upgrading the electrical system to accommodate those additional components. However, the electrical utility costs for the school district would be going down as a result of the HVAC equipment being significantly more efficient than the older units that are there right now. And lastly, some upgrades to the doors throughout the school would be adding additional ADA accessibility to bring the school districts up to the minimum American with Disabilities Act requirements, which is not currently being met in the schools.
I think one of the other things that we wanted to talk about, Jay, was the planning that allows itself to be done with a lot of systems, a lot of components, as opposed to doing them singularly. So I did talk about, the difficulty it would be in doing, an HVAC renovation where you have, 20 rooftop units that you want to take care of, but you can only do maybe one or so, and that would have to be done, over a number of years, or the referendum would allow them to be done at the same time, which would be much more cost effective. And at the forum last week, I mentioned that, getting the funding for those through the Department of Education, the 40% or 34%, I'll let Sherry talk about that in a few minutes, is a significant change in how you can do it on a bulk basis. And it's almost like 2 to 2.5 times cheaper to do it the way that the referendum would allow you to do it. I think that's really, really an important issue that we need to emphasize. The repair as you go or replace as you go is much more expensive way than doing all the units, or in this case, both schools at one time. And I think it would allow it for a lot more efficiency and obviously a lot more cost savings.
Sorry. So I believe we do have a few questions that came in already, if we can.
Okay.
Jason, the question was asked, can you go more in detail about the HVAC and talk about why that's included in these proposed plans when the district was just awarded a $3.4 million grant?
Good question.
Sure. The Clean Energy Program grant that you're referring to would cover about 75% of the HVAC projects over the two schools. The bond referendum if approved, would take care of the balance of the HVAC replacements. The systems, as I mentioned, in place were designed to last approximately 25 years and have actually lasted 40 years through obviously a very good maintenance program. But given that they are so far past their useful life, it becomes more and more risky to continue to try to repair these units, and availability of parts is dwindling quickly, if not already gone. And again, it would be a cost savings to the district's operating budget and the increase in air quality. So the idea was using both the grant and the referendum to make sure that we could cover all of the spaces in both schools.
Thank you. Ted, there was a question that was also asked about the projects. Can you go into detail about how these were the projects in particular that were selected for this proposal?
Yeah, I tried to touch on that when we first started, but I think that it really was emphasized when we were able to, when we met with the board, when we had the list of projects from the facility study, and to be able to make sure that all of the projects that were chosen were eligible for funding. I think that was a huge piece. I think that was really important, that anything that we did, 34 to 40%, as Sherry Tracy will say in a few minutes, that there would be a savings from the district from a funding perspective that allowed that to be easier to do. There are some districts, and there are many districts that have projects that the funding is not necessarily all there. It's not eligible for funding. A new turf field, almost anything outside is seen to sometimes to be not eligible. So there are those projects that wouldn't be, but I think the board did a really good service for the whole district by making the selection of having those projects that are going to be in the referendum eligible. So everything that you see, everything that we've talked about is eligible for funding. And secondly, and not to make this a small point, it's a large point. Patty has a certain amount of dollars each year in her budget that she helps, do projects that need to be done right away. I think that adding these projects that we talked about with HVAC and the roofing is over a $2 million project. You would either have to break that up into small pieces, which would not be efficient, or do it all at one shot. And I think that the board made the conscious decision, Sean, to include that in, to make sure that could be done efficiently. It could be managed over one summer, the entire project, without breaking it up into smaller pieces and having, no kidding, 8 different warranties as opposed to 1 warranty. And doing a project like that of that magnitude, the other projects are similar thought process. A larger project is going to be much more difficult, or much more easy to do than smaller projects over a long period of time. So I think that was critical for us to make sure, and the board understood right away. They were on board. They understood the selection process, and it became a very simple priority from that perspective.
Thank you. Before we move on, I'd like to take a moment, if we can, to remind everyone how to ask questions for tonight. You can please send your questions to vote@tabschools.org. We want to make the most of having our expert panelists here. So please do feel free to submit any questions you may have about the referendum. We will make sure that the correct expert is able to answer them as we keep moving forward. And we do have a lot of other segments coming up. So if you do see a topic that interests you, please just send your questions in now or as they come up. And we will try to make sure that we ask that question to the expert during the designated segment. There will be time, however, at the end, if we miss that opportunity, for you to ask questions as well. Again, thank you to Ted and Jason. Really appreciate you sharing the information about all those projects and the upcoming bond referendum. And it was good for you to further elaborate on how they're going to benefit the community by improving our security, the cost efficiency, air quality, and as you explained very clearly, that planning is better than expensive repair as you go strategy. So the total cost of the project is $12.6 million, and every project, as you clarified, is eligible for that state aid. And again, that is 40% as they say, but it could be, we use the number 34% as a more conservative estimate. And speaking of conservative estimates, I'd like to turn it over now to Senior Managing Director at Phoenix Advisors, Sherry Tracy, and Tony Solomini, who is our bond counsel from Willits, Goldman, and Spitzer, PA.
Thank you very much. Well, as we spoke about, the district is going out for a referendum, and what is a referendum? What is issuing bonds? These are all projects, and as been mentioned earlier, that would just not fit within the capital budget. There's a lot of reasons that we've spoken about to do projects through a referendum. Probably the largest of them is getting that state aid, getting the benefit of the debt service aid, which is only available when you issue debt. It's a special kind of state aid called debt service aid because it correlates exactly to when you issue debt. So in this case, the district is looking to go out and sell just over $12.6 million of bonds. These bonds are sold in the market. Investors invest in those bonds. They purchase the bonds from the district and they're repaid with taxpayer funds, offset by the debt service aid as we spoke about. Now, in looking at the tax impact, the cost of the currently the district has some debt that's going to be paid off in the next 2 years. So after the 24-25 fiscal year, that's the last year that some existing debt from previous referendums is still being paid back from previous bonds. So these projects would come in. There'd be a minor overlap of about 2 years where we'd have the new debt before the existing debt is paid off. And for a brief period, that 2-year period, the tax impact, the cost of taxpayers for debt service would go up, but then does drop down after beginning in 2026. So currently, as you see here on the slide, a taxpayer with the average home of about $266,000 in Tabernacle is currently paying about $259 a year towards debt service, towards the repayment of bonds from previous issues. The average impact by 2026, that'll go down to about $247. This is with the new project included, and be an average of about $242. So roughly about $17 less than what residents are currently paying. And again, this is just a mechanism of paying off debt service as adding new issues as we're paying off the existing bond issue. We talked about the debt service aid, the 40%, 34% component. The 40% is what the state has promised. That is the maximum for school districts to, and as was mentioned, every project is eligible for state aid. It's very rare. Ted mentioned that a district, all of the projects do receive aid. A lot of times there's projects in there that do not qualify. However, the board was very careful in selecting those projects where they could maximize the debt service aid through a referendum. Any of these projects that would be done sort of in piecemeal through the capital budget annually, as Ted mentioned, would cost more money if just segments of the roof were done at a time, and would not be eligible for this aid if it was not done through a referendum and bonds were not issued for the project. The 34% is what we've used to structure these tax impact numbers. So the numbers I spoke about are based on receiving only 34% of the aid. Although the state has promised the 40%, they have had a history of only appropriating 85% of the current amount that they've promised, which is why we've used the 34%. So you'll hear those numbers of 34 to 40%, and that's why. That's why the numbers are based, the tax impact numbers are based on the 34%, even though the eligible cost letters and the amounts you'll see on the ballot on November 8th do say 40%.
To talk a little bit about the process. So what our firm does is we're the legal representative to the Board of Education, and we provide them advice on making sure all the appropriate resolutions and all the appropriate legal steps are taken throughout the referendum process. And if you think about it this way, a referendum is a really good way to finance these capital improvements. I mean, for one, it's impossible for most districts, if not all districts throughout the state of New Jersey, to pay for large-scale capital projects through its operating fund because of the 2% annual tax levy cap. So most, if not all districts have to borrow funds to pay for these large scale projects. And by borrowing funds, it actually reduces the cost to the Tabernacle taxpayers because of the debt service aid that both Sherry and Ted spoke about. So it becomes the most cost-effective way to actually do a project because between 34 and 40% of the project is going to be paid for by the state, both annually on principal and interest. And if you think about it as a New Jersey taxpayer, this is kind of one opportunity where you have control about whether or not you can obtain funds from the state. All other aid, grants, et cetera, are usually based on different criteria, economic values, et cetera, milestones that you have to hit. Here, it's just based on whether you have a project that's eligible to receive aid. So when we have a district that's going out for a referendum, it's usually good planning on their part to actually, plan for when their aid is falling off, to plan for when their debt is falling off, and to receive debt service aid. I know we are all we get a little nervous. We watch the news, we hear about inflation, we hear about rising interest rates. According to your financial advisor, based on information she's provided, interest rates on the bond market are kind of a little not rising as quickly as some of the other interest rates, which basically equates to favorable bond interest rate borrowing environment. And how that gets established, your financial advisor uses, at this time now, conservative interest rate projections to provide you with a tax impact analysis. But once the referendum's approved, we're required by law to sell the bonds via a competitive sale. So this will get the most competitive interest rate possible for the board to pay back over the next 20 years. Which again, if you think about it, why should all the current residents of Tabernacle pay for these large scale capital improvements when they're going to be used and utilized over the next 20 years? So let all the residents that are going to be benefiting from these improvements pay their fair share of these improvements over the useful life of the asset. Always another concern we get when we talk about bonds is what happens if the project comes in more, there's always, I do a project at my house, it always comes in higher than I thought it was going to come. Well, your architect puts in contingencies, they put in escalation in these estimates, and the projects cannot come in higher than the amount that we are going to the voters to ask. The district is not allowed to spend $1 more on these projects than is being authorized by you, the voters of Tabernacle. So there's a safeguard intact that there's a ceiling to how much they can spend. Additionally, if all the projects come in lower, that money has to go back to the taxpayers as tax relief and pay down the debt. So this is a hard cap of money that will be spent on the project, and any money that is borrowed that is not spent on the project goes back to you in the form of tax relief. I think that kind of provides you a good overview of the bonding process, the financial impact that you would experience as a resident of Tabernacle.
Thank you, Tony. We did get a few questions that did come in. Would one of you feel free to answer this one, or Patty, if you feel more applicable? Can you explain more about the budget breakdown for this entire project in terms of the construction cost, I guess, in particular?
So I'll take part of it, and then if Ted and Jason want to add anything. Currently in the 22-23 budget, the only thing that you would see in there would be the cost that we allocated for the grant. The way that a school budget works, there are different funds, and the Fund 11 or Fund 10 is what it's called, but it starts with 11, the number, that are your general operating funds. So if you're on our website and you're looking at the user-friendly budget, you're going to see Fund 11, then you're going to see Fund 12, and most likely Fund 20. The way that the grant, the HVAC grant that we received from the state, that's allocated in the 22-23 budget, but it's not part of general operating costs. It's in Fund 12 and Fund 20. What will happen is we've not begun the budget for 23-24, and if the referendum passes, then this item and I'll be working with the architects to get more specific costs, then that would be in our 23-24 budget that would be submitted in March to the state. So right now, the numbers that we're dealing with are estimates prepared by our architects.
Yeah, that's correct, Patty. Listen, we did our best at the moment in time and try to project as best we can in a crazy inflationary market. But I think we did a good job. And as Sean had stated earlier, that there are contingencies built in. We do have some escalation factor, and as a matter of fact, the Department of Education encourages that because that's a good thing to do. I think anybody on the panel would agree that we think we're good. But I mean, look, 2 years ago, who would have guessed that we would have been here? And you can do that, in any increment of time. Things are, can be relatively stable, but they can jump around a little bit. So we do have some escalation in there to take care of some of those offsetting costs. And as Tony said, and I agree with him, if the prices happen to go down, that's okay. That's a good thing. And that money can go back to the district. So I think we put ourselves in a good position, as Sherry and Tony has said, to kind of utilize this mechanism of a referendum to get projects done that Patty probably couldn't get done otherwise. And I think we have the monies to do that. That's the way we're set up. And we'll take them one project at a time and deliver for the district.
Okay. Sherry, can you elaborate more on if state funding would cover up to 40% of the projects, where the other 60% of the funding then comes from?
Sure, absolutely. So the other 60%, with the little tiger paw there, would be from Tabernacle residents. So from the taxpayers. As we mentioned, right now, taxpayers are currently paying, it's very rare that a district would have no debt. Much like, where we pay mortgages on our homes and things, a lot of these projects that have to be done, and they're spread over the life of the project, as Tony mentioned. So in the past, Tabernacle's had a referendum in 96, 2005. So projects that have been done then are now getting paid off. They're now reaching the end of the term in which they were bonded for, and new projects are proposed and being added because that level of debt service is already in. Now, the debt service budget is separate from the operating budget. So while Patty has and the board have the operating budget that they're developing each year, debt service is kind of separate and apart from that, part of the overall tax rate, but it has its own separate section. And that is, as we mentioned, the debt service that's coming off these next couple of years, 2 more years left on the existing bonds that are out currently and in the marketplace. And so there'll be that brief little overlap. So while the state each year will appropriate up to 40% for the payment of the principal and the interest, which is important because it's not just the $5 million that the state has pledged, it's the interest on the borrowing of that $5 million as well. So when the bonds are sold, after the referendum passes, the district goes out to the market, as we mentioned earlier, sells $12.6 million of bonds to the public. Those bonds are purchased, and each year a payment is due, a principal and interest payment is due, repayment back on those bonds, likely for a 20-year term. And each year, the state will appropriate, as part of their aid given to the school district, up to 40% of that total cost of principal and interest. And the balance of the 60 comes from the tax rate that's established in the debt service section of the budget.
Thank you.
Sure.
Tony, can you elaborate? Is it possible that not all projects that we have listed in this referendum would end up being completed if bid amounts exceed the proposed budget?
So as I stated before, Sean, you're not allowed to spend $1 more than was authorized by the voters. So what would happen in that scenario is, Ted and Justin and their team, Jason and their team, they would monitor the projects, monitor the bids as they come in, and they may need to bid projects with alternatives. So to make sure that they have enough funds to address all of the issues to address all the projects. Projects may have to be altered, projects may have to be downsized, but you're required to legally provide all the projects that were promised to the voters that the voters voted on. So, some modifications may need to be made, but the projects have to be substantially provided.
Thank you, Sherry and Tony, for we did some additional questions there that came in. Again, if you have more questions, please email them to vote@tabschools.org. And please know if we're not able to get to your questions tonight, we will make sure we get to a response later. There's a question that came in for Ted, if you can. We were being asked for some clarification about the roof replacement project. Can you talk about the roof at the middle school and whether or not it is still under its warranty?
I can do that. I think that the timing is good. I think Jason touched on it a little bit. I can go into a little more detail. The warranty on the roof is something that you get, at the installation. And we believe that it's either a 15 or 20-year warranty, probably a 15-year warranty. And that warranty is now over. What does that mean? That means that any time that the district has to call on a contractor to fix the roof, there's a charge involved. And a new roof with a new, as Jason said, a new 30-year warranty will force a contractor, a roofing contractor that's selected by the manufacturer, to come and fix the roof at no charge. Now, obviously, new roofs aren't perfect, so we do expect some of that at the very beginning, but that should be a long time of no leaks as a new roof is installed until those issues start coming up. The 30-year warranty is based upon a thicker membrane, a better membrane that was done 15, 20 years ago. So there is a less likelihood of it being having leaks. But of course, again, no system is perfect. It's going to have a breakdown from, it being outside, amongst Mother Nature all of its life. There are some things that break down and need to be repaired from time to time. So this is a good time to do it. I think that doing it all at one shot and getting that new warranty in place is a perfect timing to be done now because your roof is no longer in warranty.
That makes sense. Thank you very much for that clarification.
Sure.
Jason, if the referendum is approved, when do you expect the projects to begin, and would you expect any disruption to the school year?
Thanks, Sean. We would endeavor to start the projects as soon as possible. Certainly, we have to proceed with designing the different projects, both with our firm and our engineering consultants, depending on the scope of each individual project. And we would certainly discuss in detail with the district the timeline for the design process and the beginning of construction. We would always endeavor to schedule the projects to eliminate or minimize any disruption to the school year, especially when students are present. Certain projects are able to be completed during the school year, but certainly safety is paramount in making sure that that consideration is looked at first with scheduling any projects. Typically, that means scheduling them for the summer and designing the projects in such a way that they can be completed in the summer and outside of the school hours.
I think to elaborate on that a little bit, Sean, I think that, we as a group, including the board and the administration, we've talked about it in three fashion. When the referendum passes, if it's lucky enough to do so, we hope that it will. We can gear up for a first summer of 2023 scope of work to get done. Certainly, not everything can get done in the first summer, either due to materials or other reasons why we can't get that done in the summer. And as Jason pointed out, clearly we can get some of those projects done during the year. But we've always talked about a summer 23 or a summer 24. And I think that's when we're going to gear most of it. But as we get opportunities, as those timeframes become available for contractors to do work and still maintain safety and so forth for the district and the kids and the teachers, we'll be able to slip those in, and I think those will be done over that time period. So, yeah, it's going to be a challenge. There will be some issues that will pop up, but we will take care of them and make sure that everybody's safe.
Thank you. We do have a question for Tony. Tony, can you talk about how we know the money that is going to be allocated in the referendum would actually be used as intended?
Sure. So the school district is required by law, as I said before, to provide the projects as set forth in the referendum. The state of New Jersey has reviewed and approved these projects and has issued what's called a preliminary eligible cost. So they're aware of these projects. They know that they're going to be voted on. Also, too, every year as a public entity, the district gets audited. So your auditor is going to come in an independent audit to make sure that all funds are being expended. Additionally, those funds are traditionally segregated into a separate account and monitored at each board meeting for all expenses as part of Patty's report and on the board secretary's monthly report on the bills list. You'll be able to track the amount of money that is going out to all the vendors. And I'm sure you're going to provide, monthly, quarterly project updates on the projects as well. So there's a lot of safety mechanisms in place to make sure that the money is spent as intended.
Thank you. Ted, could you talk about what would happen if the referendum doesn't pass? Would this mean that these projects that we're talking about tonight would not happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sean. We talked about that a little bit at the forum we had at the Olson Middle School last week. No, I think that one of the things that I mentioned was these projects aren't going away. I mean, a roof just doesn't get better over time. The HVAC equipment doesn't get better over time. These projects will have to be done. And the downside is, as I know that Sherry had spoken about earlier, and I know that Jason touched on it, is that that third bullet is on the screen now, is that it's better to do it now than do it in a repair as we go. So again, repair as we go. What does that mean? That means that as each individual unit breaks down, it has to be repaired. And now we're getting to the point where we can't find parts anymore. They have to be replaced. So they're going to have to be done. And I think from a security standpoint for the doors, I think that they have to be done. But the difference would be that the board and yourself, and of course, Patty, would say, you know what, let's do 10 doors at a time. Instead of doing, all 100 doors, let's do 10 doors at a time so we can get them done. Can that be done? The answer is yes. But there's a factor that goes on top of that makes it so much more difficult and so much more expensive. And again, you're not getting the funding, as Sherry had mentioned earlier, and as Tony had mentioned earlier. The projects will have to get done. I think nobody in the community would want them not to get done. This is that mechanism that Tony said very clearly, that how we do this is to use the referendum as a planning tool to accomplish the goals of the district that are too expensive to do in one full project over a short amount of time. It would be done over a long amount of time, and the escalation factor on top of that would be significant.
And to add to that, Ted is correct. As the parts are not able to be replaced and things expand, as the repairs become more increasingly taking part of the budget, that takes away from the budget that we use for our operating costs, our educational expenses, and what we can use for our students. So it's a balance that is sort of tipping the other way right now.
Thank you. Sherry or Tony, would you mind talking about why the district is not able to really save up money to complete some of the projects on their own without depending on the state aid?
That's a good question.
Sure, I'm happy to take this one. And I think it kind of just dovetails right into what Patty was just saying, that as far as taking up money that's designated for educational expenses within the budget. The school district is limited to a 2% levy cap each year in the operating budget, meaning that taxes can't go up more than 2% in the general fund budget. So in order to raise the money for these types of projects, that just wouldn't happen. It's already difficult with other escalating costs. Health benefits is a huge one this year, and a lot of other escalating costs that are moving higher to already keep things within 2%. So to try to fund capital expenditures in that budget, just is not possible. Now the district has done a fantastic job, has done an amazing job of putting money into capital reserve when possible, to be able to do some projects to chip away at a few things. But when you have a large scale needs, and to be able to address all these projects, like a new roof, like the doors, the alarm systems, to be able to address them all at once, and to save on some of those costs of being able to group them together to do them at the same time, it just provides for savings, in addition to, as we keep saying, the fact, and we say it because it's huge, it is the only way to get funding from the state is to do a referendum and to issue debt. The other ways to borrow money, there's a 5-year capital lease that can be done, but that 5-year capital leases are not eligible for state aid. So that means that the taxpayers pay 100% of the cost, and the cost would be repaid in 5 years. Those costs would go into repayment into the operating budget, which again, as we talked about, is really constrained. There's other regulations that keep the amount of reserves that a school district can have. It's acknowledged that the school district needs some reserves, but those amounts are also capped. So that's why doing a referendum is, it's a much needed vehicle. The state recognizes that too, which is again why they provide the aid for these types of projects. They want your buildings to stay safe, to be able to have the upgrades that are needed, and they recognize that it is it's a much needed thing in every district, just like it's needed in our homes when we need upgrades.
Thank you.
You're
Ted or Jason, could you elaborate about the fire alarm system? Will that be replaced or simply upgraded? And again, if it's being replaced, or we're talking about in particular that all existing devices will be removed, and upgrading would be that you're making slight changes while using the existing equipment.
No, as we stated earlier, and I appreciate the question, it is a complete replacement of the existing system, including wiring, devices, a new head end piece of equipment that is, kind of the brains, if you will. It's a newer, upgraded system as it relates to how the devices are installed, what kind of devices are installed. Believe it or not, the old system didn't have this, but the new systems actually have a voice-activated system for hearing impaired. There's flashes on some of the strobes for hearing impaired that can't hear at all. I mean, the system is upgraded immensely, which it's a terrific system. It's much louder, and I can tell you that because I've heard it go off, and as we're testing it. It is a loud system, so there are many upgrades. It is a complete system change, Sean, and everything is removed and new installed.
Thank you. Can you talk about, Ted or Jason, about if there been any companies ever been selected for any of the work outlined in this, and can you explain to us in more detail what the bidding process looks like?
Absolutely. Listen, when we design systems, and again, we go by the laws of the state of New Jersey. Patty is very aware of these laws, and I have to abide by them. And I think it's a good competitive atmosphere that we look for. So let's take the roof as an example. That's a perfect example. You could use any of the systems, but we have a basis of design that we design by. The base of design is a company and a standard for other companies to bid and make sure that at least meets that standard of quality while we bid those projects. So a roofing project is an example. We would do a manufacturer and a certain type of system so that other companies that are not listed as the base of design understand their system has to meet all of those parameters. It's usually not difficult. Sometimes newer companies have to struggle a little bit to get to that standard, but most companies that we have, and we also list or equals, so that they know that there is an equal, they can bid against it. And this provides a competitive atmosphere for companies to bid to contractors. So if 3 companies are bidding against one another, you're going to have a much better competitive atmosphere than if just one is monopolizing the market, if you will. So from that perspective, general contractors or HVAC contractors, whatever the trade might be, are accepting these bids from roofing manufacturers, from HVAC manufacturers, from electrical, contractors. They get different bids and they try to get as best they can to be the lowest bid for that project. And it makes a lot of sense to do it that way. You're getting the best possible price to do that for the benefit of the district. So they're not paying an exorbitant price, as you're alluding to, if somebody is the only one that can bid on that project. That's called proprietary. There are very few exceptions to that, Sean. And I think that everybody knows, keying is one. So if we were to replace, half the door locks in your building, I don't want to create a new keying system for your director of facilities. We would probably prioritize that in a non-competitive, so that we're having one system that is kind of the standard for the district. So there are a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, we try to create a very competitive atmosphere, and I think that it works well. What was the second part of your question, if I may ask again?
The bidding process itself.
The bidding process. So because not everything would be bid at one time, I don't want to bid or would not recommend bidding a roof with HVAC. That's probably a pretty good example. So the bidding process is we kind of complete, as Jason had stated earlier, our design drawings. We have a specification that works with those design drawings, and we send an ad for bid to Patty to put in the paper. Contractors see that ad. Our firm also notifies similar bidders of that, so you get maybe a little bit of a crossover there. But we want to make sure that the bidders that we're very happy with and we know bid competitively to be included in that, and they submit a bid, their best bid, if you will, to Patty for their proposal, and the bids are opened, and the lowest responsible bid, that means the bid that has all their paperwork in order and is the lowest responsible number would get the bid, and then we move on to construction after that.
Thank you. Sherry, to kind of follow up on that part of it, what happens if these bids and projects end up becoming lower in cost than estimated?
So the projects so if we end up spending less money on the projects, the bids come in lower than estimated, because Ted was very conservative in his numbers, then those monies go back to the taxpayers in the form of debt service relief. So essentially they get budgeted then into the budget to pay debt service. So the next upcoming principal payment, say there was $600,000 left over from the total amount, after all the projects were completed, that money, then Patty can take that money and use that to budget towards to pay that debt service payment when those bonds come due in the next payment. So essentially that's 600,000 less, and I'm using that number as an example, that would then be raised from the taxpayers instead. So it goes directly back to taxpayers in the form of debt service relief.
Okay. Thank you. This is more of a question, I guess, for the project cost breakdown for Ted or Jason. You talk about how much is allocated currently in the budget plan for door and hardware replacement as a follow-up, I guess, for security, safety, or for accessibility.
I can do that. I actually have the numbers here. Give me 1 second. I had them broken down by school, and I can tell you that the doors for the middle school is a total project cost of $520,000. And for the other school, it's a very similar amount. Give me 1 second. The doors are $138,000. As it relates to the door security and it's, again, this is doors and hardware for those locks that are not meeting the current standard that the district would like to have.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sherry, can you explain again about how all these projects and improvements are possible with, and while the town's school debt taxes would be lower than they are right now within a few years?
Yes, absolutely. As we mentioned, it's very common for school districts to go to referendum, every several years, consolidate some projects that need to be done and go out for referendum. So, and then to sell the bonds and repay them back over a term of, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, depending on what the project is. Because Tabernacle has a couple of bond issues that have been getting paid off. One was paid off in 2022. The next will be paid off in 2025 as that debt is coming off. And that's kind of why you see a little bit of a variance in what the tax impact will be. One bond issue, as you mentioned, was paid off in 2022. So that debt is gone, paid, fully repaid for those projects. And then there's a couple of years left, 3 years left on an existing bond issue. So the new bond issues would overlap briefly for those 2 years. And because of the maximum, because we're receiving the maximum amount of state aid for these projects, and because the projects are a different size and scope from some projects that were done in previous years, the actual cost tax impact to them is less than what the taxpayers have been paying, not just for the current year, but really since 2005 for the tax rate. So the taxes, just for, again, maximizing the state aid on those projects, the net cost of it just ends up being less than the last time that the district went out for referendum.
Now, Sherry, you keep on mentioning about state aid. Can you talk more about where that actually comes from? Since in particular, I know we've talked a lot about how if we don't use this, we kind of lose the money, so to speak. Can you also explain what that exactly means?
Sure. So, the state raises New Jersey taxpayers. All New Jersey taxpayers pay into a fund in which the state allocates money. The state raises as the state does their budget. The state of New Jersey each year does their budget. They allocate a portion to cover debt service aid for projects all across the state. And they say, here's our pot of money. We've kept it aside. In order for you to access this money, you have to go pass a voter referendum. And if your projects are successful, you have access to this money. So as taxpayers in New Jersey, we're all paying into that fund. You only can access the fund when you pass a referendum and you issue bonds to fund the projects. So those funds are already there. We're paying into them already in order for Tabernacle, in order for us to go get our share of that money rather than allowing it to go to other districts. In which, right now, currently it does. Any district that passes a referendum, and there was, I think, over 600 million of new projects that were approved at the referendum vote earlier this year in October. And those districts now have access to those funds for any qualified projects. The funds aren't running out, so it's not that we have to get it, immediately, but the state has done them in the past, I'll say, close the window. There was a period, and Ted or Jason or Tony, correct me if I have the dates wrong. I think it was 2007 to 2010, but there was a brief period of time when the state said, no more. We're not, any project you want to do right now, we are not approving for debt service aid. Our budgets are too tight. We're not going to raise that money. And we're not going to allocate that money out for projects. So if you needed to do a referendum, if you were, you had crucial capital improvements that needed to be done in 2007, 2008, the state was not approving those projects for debt service aid. So the state can decide not to do that going forward. The window's open now. The fund is there now. So Tabernacle has received those eligible cost letters, meaning the state is reserving some funds right now for Tabernacle. So if the referendum is successful, those funds are there for you. They've already been promised. You just need the voter approved referendum in order to access them.
Thank you for that clarification.
Sure.
Ted or Jason, can you talk, we've mentioned accessibility as part of the goal for the referendum projects. Can you talk about what exactly will be done to improve accessibility in the buildings?
Jay, I'll let you take that.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. Accessibility improvements would include making sure that a certain portion of the spaces within each building are accessible to those with different disabilities, be it in a wheelchair or otherwise. And with the upgrades needed at either one of the Tabernacle schools, they might involve either replacing a door handle on certain doors, maybe changing it from a knob to a lever. It also might involve changing the direction that the door swings to provide the amount of clearance that's needed to use that door and go through that door. Again, I think we were touching on the fact that most of the upgrades from an accessibility standpoint for ADA were centered around improvements to doorways and accessing different spaces through certain doorways to make all of the spaces in the building that might be needed to accommodate somebody with different disabilities, the access that they need to use the schools.
Thank you very much. So again, I'd like to remind everyone to please visit our website, which is vote.tabschools.org for more information, which is included in our frequently asked questions, which also includes information about our projects and voting information. The district will also share information about the bond referendum through social media, as we've been doing leading up to tonight. Now, please remember, it's important that you and everyone in town makes their voice heard by voting on November 8th. Polls on that date will be open from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. Districts 1 and 4 vote at the Emergency Services Building, which is at 134 New Road. Districts 2, 3, and 5 vote at the Tabernacle Firehouse at 76 Hawken Road. And you can also vote by mail, which is available, and applications for that, however, must be mailed to arrive at the county by November 1st. Remember, every single vote counts for a referendum project. We'd like to thank those of you in the Tabernacle community who took the time to join us tonight to learn more about the district's bond referendum. And I'd like to also thank our panelists for sharing the expertise and insight on the referendum with us tonight. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.